Now, next up, we will be looking at some of the things that actually Lily just mentioned. We'll be sharing perspectives on leadership, the future of work, and the role of technology in addressing social issues. And of course, I will be leaving the floor to the wonderful Georgette Tan, who is the president of United Women Singapore, and she will be in conversation with our first special guest of the day. As soon as that stage is ready, we have, of course, Minister of State from Singapore's Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Social and Family Development, Sun Xueling. And she'll be sharing some more on those perspectives on leadership and the future of work. And of course, the role of technology, tech, as a vector for inclusivity to address social issues. So, once the stage is set, please give a very warm welcome and a round of applause to our special guests, Georgette and Minister Sun.
Good morning, everybody. And just want to thank Lily for that great opening session. I loved what you were saying, really resonated. And thank you to the organizers of Women's Forum for bringing it back to Singapore. We are delighted to have you back. Welcome home. And to all our audience here, thank you for making time. I want to do a very special shout out to the men in the audience. And I know there are a few. It's always wonderful to see the men turn up, show up, and be supportive of the women in their lives. So for all the men in the audience, ladies, please, a round of applause for them. And gentlemen, know that you are the enlightened ones. I have the pleasure this morning of a quick morning chat with Minister Sun Xueling. As many of you know, she is Minister of State for the Ministry of Home Affairs, but not just, because in addition to that very large portfolio, and some might say a male-dominated portfolio, she's also got the also extensive Ministry of Social and Family Development. So, Minister, if we can start off, you didn't start your career in the public sector, in serving in the government. Quite on the contrary, it was the reverse. You actually started in private sector. Can you share with the audience a little about that journey?
Thank you, Georgette, for that question. A very good morning to everyone, both ladies and gentlemen in the audiences. Indeed, I did not start with public service. I started my career in the financial services industry. Some might argue that it is a male-dominated industry, in particular because I was in investment banking for many years, and the market that I was active in was China, which is, well, how would I say, doubly impacted by male representation. Why did I start off in that industry? I think what tech was in the past 5 years was what finance was in the past 15, 20 years. And when I studied in our IHLs, for want of a better word, I wanted to do something that was, in my mind, very rigorous, very statistics, very math and science-oriented. I totally heard what Professor Lily Kong said about the importance of the humanities. And I'm not dissing that, because I was a human student in junior college. But when I went to university, I was quite focused on wanting to make sure that after graduation, that I would be in an industry that I could apply some hard, logical cognitive thinking skills, and at that point in time, what was fashionable was the finance industry. But the finance industry has transformed immensely over the past decade. The use of technology, the use of, I would say, even data analytics, and now looking forward, generative AI is coming into finance. And if finance professionals do not upskill themselves in these areas, the typical financial analyst type of job could be a job of the past, because so many things that could be done on worksheets will be turbocharged by the use of AI. So I started in that industry, but as for many women, I think we have different seasons of life. And when I became a mother, and I started thinking about what I wanted to do for my family, for society, wanting to build a better future for everyone that I love around us.
For your daughters, especially.
My daughters, yes, they're very important to me. I felt that public service was my calling. Thank you.
So, and your role has been at the forefront, whether it's been, and I know this for a fact, leading the charge a few years ago on the task force for, against domestic violence, right? Coming up with the report that tackled the ecosystem, not just on the victim front, but perpetrators too. Leading the charge when it came to the white paper, that benchmark white paper that we all refer to and was recently updated. So all these things are now under your belt. And what more do you see that we need to be doing for the women here to get them on this pathway of leadership?
Thank you. Indeed, I think in the past 4 to 5 years, the Singapore government has made women's development a key focus. Not to say that it has not been a priority over the years, but one could look at landmark legislation, such as the Women's Charter in 1961,
Yep.
and then ask ourselves, what are the next milestones along these 2 decades of women's development? And we felt that a white paper was necessary to draw a line in the sand and basically say that there are 5 key areas, such as prevention of violence against women, such as women in workplaces, such as making sure that societal norms and gender stereotypes do not impact women's development, so on and so forth. So we wanted to have that laid out so that we'll have a blueprint for the next 10 years. So I think one of the key things that we did was that we embarked on very key changes when it comes to legislation. So changes to the Women's Charter when it came to family violence-related amendments. We also wrote out the Online Criminal Harms Act. We also looked at the Broadcasting Act, amendments to the Broadcasting Act, so that we look at take care of online safety for women and girls. And the upcoming legislation on workplace fairness to ensure that there is no discrimination against women in workplaces. We wanted to make sure that these bare minimum, in my opinion, obstacles to women, whereby it could lead to discrimination of women in different domains, that we make sure we do the necessary housekeeping. But I use the word minimum because we should have that in a society that's inclusive and updated, to reflect the roles that women have in our society. Then the question for us is, what is the next bound? I think Professor Lily Kong had sort of alluded to that in her opening statement, where she talked about caregiving roles that women continue to face a disproportionate burden of. She talked also about certain gender stereotypes that we need to be conscious about. And even when we passed new legislation, she had talked about how working from home could negatively impact women as well. So even as we pass landmark legislation, we have to also be critically aware about how it's going to be executed on the ground, because it impacts men and women, families and employers. And legislation aside, how it is being translated, executed on the ground is ultimately going to be the key barometer of how it impacts women's lives. And Singapore is a very outcome-oriented country, right? When we look at policies, we don't just care about whether or not it looks fair and inclusive, but whether it actually is fair and inclusive on the ground. And that's why we're going to have to monitor. We're going to have to work with stakeholders to make sure that what actually happens on the ground is in line with the spirit of the legislation. Thank you.
So moving to the topic of technology, which is obviously the focus here for this conference. And I know for a fact that you're a huge advocate and proponent and supporter and driver of tech, particularly STEM, and again, focused again specifically in tech, for women in the workplace, but also even starting younger, so girls and tech. And maybe you can share with the audience your thoughts on where you see technology utilized here in the education space, not just for tech, the use of tech, but also studying technology and how this will in fact create pathways for our next generation of young women.
Thanks for that. First and foremost, I would like to thank yourself, Georgette, and the organization that you lead, United Women Singapore. I had the pleasure of attending STEM Fest that UWS has been organizing over many years, benefited many women and girls when it came to having opportunities to do short internships with financial services and tech companies, about learning tech skills, and there was a wonderful turnout. I think 500-600 people at STEM Fest. That was only 2 weeks ago, yes, if I do not recall wrongly. So coming back to your question, indeed we have to start young, and we start young on many different fronts. First and foremost, as early as preschool years. So these are children under 6. We want to make sure that we have a inclusive preschool environment where teachers are cognizant that they shouldn't be treating boys and girls differently. So it could be simple things like sports, for instance, or the use of digital devices for learning purposes, not to play games in class, that boys and girls are accorded the same treatment, given the same opportunity. And when we go into the MOE, Ministry of Education system, from primary school to secondary school and into the IHLs, digital skills as a basic fundamental skill is taught through, obviously, not just science and what we have, applied learning courses and so on and so forth, ALP, I think applied learning programs, my apologies. So that's in the curriculum, but apart from that, using tech as a means of digitalization, as a means to communicate. So for instance, in primary school already, the children use the student learning space to do their homework. And this was actually very critical during the COVID-19 period. We also made sure that all households, regardless your income status, had access to digital devices. And this was very apparent during COVID-19, where we made sure that the schools actually had these devices, not just the laptops or the iPads, but also the subscription, so that they could have, just in case they do not have Wi-Fi at home, that they had the dongle to be able to go online. So these are ways in which the government makes sure that digital access is not limited to particular segments of society. And we're not forgetting the seniors as well. There is the Seniors Go Digital program. And it's especially important to work with seniors because so many government functions and daily activities are now happening online through, for example, something straightforward as digital payments. But yet at the same time, seniors are worried about being scammed online. So I think at the end of the day, being versed in basic digital literacy is necessary, and that's why we have the digital Seniors Go Digital program, and we have our digital ambassadors to go around and educate seniors about the use of tech. So I think from the examples I have given, it is not just about tech as a topic that needs to be discussed and studied, but also the use of tech in daily living, the daily execution of tasks, because when you are using it on a day-to-day basis, I think you become less adverse to it. And like it or not, the whole society is moving in this direction, and I think the absolute fundamental need to make sure that our citizens are digitally literate is an important one.
And specific to women, because again, they sometimes get left behind. What more can be done to ensure that these women don't get left behind, whether or not they are the seniors, whether they are the stay-at-home mums, the women who maybe have given up work to be caregivers? Yes. Or how do we ensure that the girls who may not come from the privileged households, they're not left behind? What more needs to be done for them, Minister?
So I think, coming back again to STEM Fest that UWS had organized, I think there was a very specific targeted attempt to reach out to women and girls, and girls in particular who come from more difficult, needy backgrounds. To let them know that they have opportunities to learn tech skills and to be able to apply them in a company, whether or not they are using tech or having tech as a product or a direct service that they're providing, or that it is just being readily used in the workplace. I think to give these girls who come from less privileged backgrounds these opportunities to work in these companies, I think in itself is really a very, very important point. I say that because when I started my own journey in the finance industry, my training was not technically in finance. My training was, I was a humanities student, and then I studied economics and statistics, right?
Yes.
But when I went into financial services, I found out that you had to be very, very good at Excel spreadsheets. We might have some investment bankers in the audience. Everybody was asking you about what your net present value was, or valuation of companies, the different scenarios, and so on and so forth. You had to be very, very good with Excel functions. And basically, I just doubled down on my learning and training by going to Bloomberg every lunch break to sign up for their courses that were available during lunch. So I think what I'm trying to say is that there must be opportunities for girls to catch up if they do not naturally have access to those opportunities to come into contact with tech. And that's apart from the important work that NGOs such as UWS do, we also see it across the different associations in Singapore. We have the SG Women in Tech movement in Singapore, which has benefited 123,000 women and girls already. There is I think a younger version of it called Girls in Tech.
That's right.
Yes, and various different, there's a Tech Skills Accelerator program that I think the IMDA also rolls out. So the career conversion programs as well. So I think all these are initiatives to make sure that no woman or girl is left behind. And for the women who perhaps have chosen to stay at home, we of course have the nationwide Skills Future program. And there are different grants that are available and subsidies available under the Skills Future framework, whereby these women can actually use these subsidies and training grants to take up courses that would enable them to become more digitally literate.
So this actually speaks to what Lily was talking about, lifelong learning.
Yes.
Right? And never really stopping that learning process all along the way.
And I think what's important is really our mindsets around it, right? Because I think it's always daunting for a woman or a girl to go into a meeting room or a workplace and then to find out that maybe you are that 20% who is female in the room, and to have 8 out of 10 persons looking back at you. And sometimes the men, oftentimes in Singapore, I don't think people are ill-intentioned. I don't think anyone is trying to be unkind, but sometimes you do come across situations whereby you can get, I think they say mansplained.
Mansplaining.
Yes, mansplained, yes, where you get talked over. Yes. Yeah, it happens. How many of our women here have experienced that? I think quite a few
I see a few hands out
I
there.
see quite a few hands, yes. They don't mean any harm, they think, yes. But you could be like, and sometimes I think when women speak, we tend to be quite, we want to be agreeable, right? So we kind of take care of people's feelings. And so when we start off, there is a little bit of a preamble. We're going to come to the main point very soon, but let me just lay the ground and, take note of everyone's feelings, and then I'm going to get to the main point, right? But before I get there, I get mansplained. So that's the bit whereby I think we have to learn how to maneuver in such circumstances, and while not exactly calling out the gentleman for being, for perpetrating this particular act, I think sometimes it's worthwhile just to shoot a particular look in his direction and let him know that you would like to complete your sentence. Yes. So I think these are the little things that we have to do for ourselves, because otherwise our voices are not being heard. But we shouldn't put all the responsibilities on the women. And I think increasingly there are different organizations, different departments, and I know that this is happening in our IHLs. So for certain disciplines which are male-dominated, I know that the deans of those schools, that when it comes to bringing in new student cohorts, they actually really are more targeted in their attempts to bring women into their disciplines of study. So for instance, I understand that, for instance, in law school, and I am at the SMU, yes. So I think that there are some initiatives to make sure that the classroom dynamics are such that women have equal opportunities to speak. It could be as simple as when we have a class, just a general discussion. When the lecturer asks a question, do you just ask the question and wait for someone to raise their hand, whereby the girls may say, okay, let me listen to someone else speak first, and then you have all the boys or the young men raise their hands, and if at the end of the day, classroom participation is marked according to how active you are, yes, during class discussions, then there is kind of like perhaps an unfair advantage that the boys have had. So it is up to the lecturer to organize the way class facilitated discussions go. So for instance, rather than have a free-for-all, would he be a bit more intentional in making sure that the girls have an opportunity to speak? Yeah. Say, for example, in having directed questions rather than open-ended questions for anyone to just raise their hand to speak. But that said, I'm not saying that all the blame is on the lecturer. Girls have to be able to stand up for themselves as well and know that you should lean in and raise your hand if you really do have a point to make. And this doesn't just extend to classroom dynamics, but also I think when it comes to interviews where girls join certain disciplines in the IHLs, the recruitment process. How do you advertise? How do you market those courses? Are you intentional in wanting to invite women candidates to come to the fore? I think all that signals and indicates to the girls as to how valued they will be, they can be, they are, especially if they know that they are facing a male-dominated industry.
Well, thank you. And I note that we're short on time. Yes. We're very, very tight on time. But I really appreciate that you ended on a note which I was also going to ask you, which is what you thought would be the advice that you wanted to give everybody out here. And you gave plenty of advice in the last couple of minutes. Great suggestions that I think we can all take as individuals, men and women, but also as parts of organizations that we belong to, whether it's the schools, the IHLs, the universities, or in many of the instances here, women in the audience here and men in the audience here, organizations and companies that you belong to, associations and networks. So it is an all of society effort right? We are very fortunate that obviously, we have support from leaders like yourself, Minister, but we also have support from organizations like the Women's Forum, who, spearhead and bring to light the importance of collaboration and the partnership that happens, that intersection between private sector, public sector, and obviously the CSOs and NGOs. So ladies and gentlemen, on that note, a round of applause for our guest of honor.